Okay, let's get started with our fourth module. Um, so this takes us into, here, let me go ahead and start this, into a very specific theme, one that we've touched on already with our trip to the Mission San Francisco, but one we want to explore with a little greater depth today. So we talked a bit earlier today about where we've been to this point. And so we've discussed in pretty good detail and pretty good depth the political history of the sort of coming of the Spanish into the New World. We've looked at some of the social dynamics that have gone into it. Now we want to take a look at this third sort of important, some might say the most important theme. And that is of the sort of religious history of colonial Mexico, so of the colonial New World in general, but very specifically for colonial Mexico. So this title up here, Magistrates of the Sacred, these priests and parishioners in colonial Mexico City. This phrase, Magistrates of the Sacred, was used during the colonial period. It's also the title of one of the most famous books of Mexican history. It was written by an author by the name of William Taylor, who actually became my dissertation advisor. So he is a very important, towering figure of Mexican history, and I am indebted to him for all I know about this topic. So I want to share a couple of Dr. Taylor's themes with you today. So again, the big narrative, perhaps a slight oversimplification in some ways, but the big narrative that we're talking about for this colonial period is this clash of cultures. So it's two separate and distinct, equally highly developed cultures, the native Aztec, native Indian, and the European Spaniard, coming together and clashing, sort of incongruous cultures coming together in some ways. And as this image here by Roberto Cueva del Rio notes, one of the main sort of influences of Spanish colonial society is that of Spanish Catholicism. The Spaniards, more than any other culture, any other colonial culture, invested great time and energy and resources and manpower into both constructing the edifices, the buildings associated with Spanish Catholicism, and with the mission, the third of our three G's, the mission to convert, to bring the non-Christian, non-Western, indigenous Indian people into the folds of the Catholic flock, to inculcate them into the principles of Catholicism, and hopefully, as part of this mission, bring them to a true conversion and to true salvation. This is very much a part of this process. Now, if we remember from our discussion last time about our city of palaces, many of the palaces of this city and of this period were its churches. And here we're looking at, again, this image, this folded diorama of Mexico City. And on the inverse side, if we remember, it tells a very specific story. This is of the Spaniards and the Aztecs coming together almost like this biblical war, this biblical battle. It's part of the sort of the greater struggle, the triumph over the battle between good and evil, and the triumph of the good. And in this case, the good is the Catholic, the Christian. Well, this sort of this highlighting of the importance of the church as a structure is common throughout all of colonial Mexico during this period, but especially in the Valley of Mexico. That any tiny little pueblo you go into, it will always have sort of very beautifully constructed Catholic church with ornate detail both outside and in. In some ways and sometimes is very much in contrast to the sort of general poverty that surrounds it. Now again, to this point, we've sort of discussed two of our three G's in depth. This idea of gold, right? Literal gold or wealth as a primary motivating factor for the Spaniards that came over. Sort of what led them, what was their motive for coming into the New World, devoting all that time and energy. So gold is part of it. Personal glory and glory to king and to nation. The expansion of territory, the expansion of the population, right, through bringing in new citizens, new members of the Spanish Empire. But again, very much part of this, connected to all of it, at least for the king, very much a Catholic king, is this third G, this devotion to God, and this understanding that this is not just a profit-seeking mission, but also very much a mission of conversion, of salvation, of faith, of demonstrating sort of faith and belief in God. Now this becomes very difficult for the Europeans in many ways when they encounter practices that are, seem on the surface very much at odds or sort of antithetical against the sort of beliefs and practices of Catholics. And so there are many Spanish friars during this period that saw the native people as savage people, that they were like animals, and they should be harnessed for their labor and for profit. But there was an equally powerful voice in the other direction that said, these are not savages. These, like all of us, are children of God. And just as the Spanish king owes a debt of obligation to protect his own citizens back in Spain, so too does he owe this obligation, this debt, to protect the natives in the New World. And so this voice, this powerful voice, became the dominating voice. This is the voice that won out. This is Bartolomé de las Casas, the famed friar who was described as the protector of the Indians. It was his voice that won out. And on the basis of this belief that these are not savages per se, they are not animals, but they are like children, right? They're not as far along in terms of human and cultural development. We have an obligation to help them along. This became the basis for this new Christianizing mission. So these were the first friars, the first Franciscan friars from the Franciscan order brought over to the New World to help organize this Christianizing mission. And you can see them. So there's 12 of them, right? Just like the 12 apostles. I mean, so much was this seen as sort of an extension of the biblical story. And if you look above them, these are the Aztec gods, right? These sort of winged beasts, right? They're very much sort of part of the connected to the devil, to the true Christian underworld, And here it's the forces of good, our 12 friars, battling the forces of evil, the idols of Aztec worship. Then part of this process, this Christianizing process, was taking many of the native practices and simply eradicating them. There was a whole process. So this shows Spanish friars burning Aztec idols, Aztec images and Aztec idols in great bonfires. But an equal part of it was an educational mission, an attempt to bridge the divide between practices that on the whole looked very different and yet, deep down, shared some fundamental similarities. So this is a modern mural in Mexico City showing or depicting the experiences in the mission system. And it's representing, if you look at this big cross on the left, is a sort of hybrid model, integrating images like the skull and the marigolds and the plant life of Aztec beliefs, this large obsidian disc in the center, which the Aztecs used to divine the wishes of their spirits. This was an actual cross in central Mexico that sort of involved all of these practices. So there was this very sincere attempt to bridge the divide between the sort of practices of Spanish Catholicism and the practices of the native Aztecs. And we see it, right, how it was represented back to Europe as part of this narrative of this new Garden of Eden, right? We've created Mexico City as this paradise city, this city of palaces, high in the mountains, where this Christianizing mission can take place. Now, we've seen it already a bit. We've talked about how in the Templo Mayor, which was the Aztec city center, how it was transformed into the Spanish cathedral, the Cathedral of Mexico City. And many of the stones you see in it were actually taken from Aztec temples, and it was turned into a Catholic cathedral. So this is in the Central Plaza of Mexico City. This is a wonderful example, but it's not the only one. We've also now taken a look. So we visited the San Francisco the Mission San Francisco the other day. Part of this 21 mission, sort of again, this evangelizing, conversion process. So these are the two big examples, right? But they're not the only ones. And in some ways, they're not the greatest representation of this attempt to bridge the divide between Spanish Catholicism and native Aztec practices. And in fact, we'll want to look at a couple other examples. Now, I want to take you through a quick tour of some architecture. In the first decades after the Spanish arrived, again the year was 1521, they went about their process, this conversion process, very quickly, without much of an eye for ornamentation. So this is in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, and this cathedral was built in the 1550s. It has almost this fortress look to it, right? It's almost like a factory. Here's where we're going to churn out newly baptized Christian souls out of the savage Indian people. Well, there are many that look like this, right? This is a very sort of utilitarian and not very stylistic. Again, this is like the factory floor. But this gives way to a very different architectural aesthetic, where you need to lure in the native people. They're not going to necessarily come of their own volition to a factory. You need to lure them in, try and speak to them on their own terms. Create these small centers, these oases, right, of peace, of tranquility, of salvation. So this is in the Valley of Mexico. This is the church of the Mary of Los Remedios. This is in a city called Cholula. And in the background, you see this great pyramid, Popocatépetl, which the Aztecs believed was inhabited by a god who would get angry and cause eruptions. And so the Spanish took the time and energy to build in the shadow of Popo, the great volcano, this beautiful church that also happened to lie or take as its foundation the ruins of an abandoned native pyramid. So transforming what was a sacred site for the native people into something that was a sacred site for the Spanish, the European Catholics, right? Sort of it's to bridge the divide between older practices and more modern spiritual practices. And this is a really amazing site if you go to visit it. Not only for the sort of the scenic splendor, but also the level of detail within the interior. And these very painstakingly sculpted and decorated this facade on the outside. This high degree of ornamentation. So these are hand-painted, hand-fired tiles. Puebla was one of the great centers for tile making, influenced by the Chinese. So this is the decorations on the outside. Another highlands area, so this is about an hour outside of Mexico City in a city called Taxco, which is known for silver mining. The silver barons in that area provided funding to build this huge, elaborate church called Santa Prisa. This is in the highlands of Morelos. And similarly, right, this is not a factory floor. It's not a sort of generic structure. It is beautifully decorated. Hundreds of artisans carefully crafting each of the sort of ornamental and architectural details. This is another one in Puebla, a bit simpler on the outside in some ways. But again, this emphasis on this very distinct style of ornamentation. If we look even closer, right, these are often Spanish, but many times indigenous or native artisans and artists doing the work and creating these. And so the likenesses of these two saints here have almost a sort of crude and cartoonish look to them. And yet, if you think of the hours and hours that went into crafting and laying each tile, and the purpose, right, to lure people in, to create this effect of a sanctuary and spiritual center. One of my favorites, so a cathedral is like a huge regional church. So it's like the most important central church. Here's one in the north in the city called Zacatecas. And here, the level of ornamentation on the outside, it's like it's meant to just bowl you over, to knock you over with its splendor. And you think again of the hundreds and hundreds of hours that must have gone into crafting all of these things by hand. So this is all carved stone, is a carved stone facade. It's a very distinctive style. So there's a general style of this period that's called the Baroque. You've likely heard of Baroque music. Well, in Baroque artwork and ornamentation and architecture, it is a very ornate style. So the palace of Louis XIV, for example, of Versailles, done in that highly ornate style, that's considered Baroque. But it takes almost a sort of strange left turn in Mexico, in which the Baroque sensibilities of Europe meet with the practices and sensibilities of the native artisans and artists, and it changes, it shifts into something that art historians very accurately call a Mexican Baroque. And it's not just the outside that's meant to bowl you over. It happens inside as well. It's almost like an infection in some ways of ornamentation. It takes over every square inch, every surface, available surface. Layer upon layer of image, ornamentation, gold leaf, gold filigree, plaster, paint. Almost like stalagmites and stalactites in caves, right? They're just sort of almost organic, growing out of the walls. Just dripping. And again, with many of these being created by indigenous artisans, the faces of the figures slightly crude in their style. Not the sort of the perfection, let's say, of Versailles or of the Italian masters, but almost like kind of like a folk art style. But again, just falling off the roofs and the walls, dripping down in sort of weight of ornamentation. And the experience, art historians and theologians have defined it, is like this, create this multi-sensory experience, this synesthesia, this assault on the senses. Not just sight, right? But also of sound, of odor. They would circulate big clouds of incense. Let me play some Mexican Baroque for you as we take a short look at this and just get a feel for it. So this is Mexican Baroque music. This was designed by or written by Mexican composers. And imagine this experience, this synesthesia. Walking into these spaces, big clouds of incense smoke drifting through, the choir above singing out, the voices ringing out, the voices of a priest speaking a sermon. On feast days, the addition of flowers, right? Candles. This assault on the senses meant to bring about in the moment a true sort of spiritual experience, this conversion experience. to the degree possible. It was very much a part of it. This was the Mexican Baroque. I'll go ahead and pause this. So if this is part of it, right, we want to be cognizant of the tools that the Spanish friars, the priests, and brought to bear to try and, again, bring about this experience of this synesthesia, this assault on the senses, as you try and bring about this true spiritual conversion. But this would be to say that the native people, right, they're just sort of passive receptacles. They just sort of take it in and they're transformed. And it's to a degree to take away their agency, to take away the power they have as historical agents of change. Right? To make everything that you see within the Baroque churches, all of the ornamentation, all of the figures, as simply didactic, or as sort of modes of teaching. It's all about sort of teaching and instruction, and the native people were just sort of passive vehicles, passive recipients of this teaching. But in fact, it wasn't like that. Even as they learned the messages and the forms of Catholicism. This is taken from an early, this is a 1580s instructional manual for Catholic priests in South America, translating the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, into, in this case, the native languages of Quechua and Aymara. Even as they're learning these things, they're also participating. And you see, again, if we think of this idea of agency, the native people are agents in this process, agents of change. They get to influence the direction that Catholicism takes. And so, the images of Christ, for example, the didactic images of Christ suffering on the cross, of the pain and the suffering that Christ felt as he went through his stations of the cross, as it's taught to the native people, right, in a very didactic way, meant to instruct exactly how painful and how much Jesus suffered. As it takes this, this very sort of Baroque sensibility that emphasizes the pain and the suffering, it moves out in directions beyond the control of the Spanish friars. So we have, in the 1600s, the story, right, of one of these suffering Christs. This is the story of the Cristo Renovado, the sort of self-healing Christ. There was this image in the 1600s, this sculpture of a Christ that was falling apart. You see about halfway through the selection on the left. It was falling apart, such that in the year 1615, the Mexican archbishop ordered that this Christ be broken apart and buried with the next adult who was to die in the parish. And as the story goes, again, of this suffering image of Christ, for 6 years it was meant to be broken apart. Nobody died. And late at night, in the chapel where it was held, mysterious groans and celestial music would drift out. Finally, as the native people described it in 1621, this image of Christ that was supposed to be destroyed began to perspire and twitch. During a fierce storm, it floated free of its cross, floated around, and restored itself to beautifully fine condition before reattaching itself to the cross. After that, the story goes, the image continued to show signs of life, signs of the divinity. Sometimes it would open its eyes, it would continue to perspire, it would spurt actual blood. And later connected to it, you saw miraculous and marvelous healings of local people and abundant crops. There was this sort of apparition in some ways, right? This miraculous apparition. It was beyond the efforts of the archbishop, the bishop, and the other Spanish ministers to control it. It's like it had gotten loose in the native society. Here's an image of the actual Cristo Renovado. So we can imagine, right, in the 1620s, celestial music and groaning. This thing begins to perspire and to twitch and to actually flow blood until it miraculously heals itself and reattaches itself to the cross. And these are not made-up stories. I mean, these are the things that people themselves in these communities believe based on their experiences, their religious experiences of Catholicism and of their heritage, their sort of indigenous religious heritage. And that's not the only one like that. So the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe, this miraculous apparition, is a similar story. I won't go into all the details here, but she appears before an Indian man named Juan Diego. She tells him to gather flowers into his cloak, which he dutifully does. And when he takes these flowers down to the local bishop to show the miraculous flowers to this bishop, Juan Diego opens his cloak, and instead of flowers, there is the actual image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, painted or burned or emblazoned on the front of his cloak. So the Virgin of Guadalupe that we see is herself this miraculous apparition. And again, this is sort of out of the control of the Spanish church. And it continues. These are what are known as ex voto paintings, in which native people, or not native people, but the people of Mexico would paint to commemorate miraculous interventions from saints and holy people in their lives. So this is from the year 1853. This is a man writing to thank Jesus and thank Mary for intervening on behalf of his wife, who had a blood disease, and saving her from death. And note the Christ, the bleeding Christ on the wall, right? This miraculous apparition in a person's home. Even as late as the 1940s in Mexico, right? This local tradition, this agency with the Mexican people as agents of change. Here is the Virgin of Guadalupe appearing before a farmer whose tractor was on fire, and the miraculous appearance of the Virgin Mary, she put out the fire such that his tractor was saved. So here this man is giving thanks. So again, even as the Spanish friars are trying to control the sort of the boundaries of the Catholic faith, and the sort of the conversion to Christianity, certain local practices bleed into it, right, such that it gets slightly out of control. By the end of the Spanish colonial period, right, so this miraculous apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe is seen as the first great miracle moment in that nation's history. And it's this same Virgin of Guadalupe who becomes the sort of patron saint for all of Mexico. This saint, sainted by the Pope, and yet the product of local belief systems, local practices that are mostly Catholic, but not entirely. Again, somewhat out of control. This patron saint, the Virgin of Guadalupe, becomes the image, the adopted image of the modern Mexican state. As we'll see as we move into next week, with the coming of independence, the end of Spanish colonial rule in Mexico, it's the Virgin Mary, and it's this local faith, informed by the synesthesia, right? That overflowing of ornamentation and detail and smoke and music. So informed by that experience, but also informed by local practices that are out of Spanish control, becomes its own thing, its own sort of proudly, even defiantly independent Mexican thing. So that's where we'll leave off for today.